Okay, I guess we'll get started. Thank you so much for coming out. My name's Philip Barr. I'm head of adult services here at Fairfield Public Library. So if any of you are from out of town, which I don't, I see some unfamiliar faces, so welcome to Fairfield Public Library in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm thrilled to have, here we go. I'm thrilled to have my friend Neil Theise, who's just published a really incredible book with us this evening. I'm just going to quickly go over sort of the outline of how we're going to conduct the conversation tonight, and there's going to be plenty of time after we talk for you all to ask questions as well. So I'll start off with an intro. I'll just tell you Neil's biography, and then I'm going to ask him to tell us how he got to here, to today, with his book. Neil's going to read a bit.
The short version or the long version?
Probably the short version. And then Neil's going to read a bit from the book. I'm going to ask him why complexity theory, because obviously that was chosen for the book. And then we'll dig into the book. And Neil has a lot to say, and I have some highlights when I read the book of questions that you may have. And so we'll do that for a while, and then we'll have the Q&A afterwards. So sounds good? All right, let's get started. So I'd like to welcome Neil Theise. Neil's a professor of pathology at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Through his scientific research, he's been a pioneer of adult stem cell plasticity. I knew I was going to say
I can't say it either.
Plasticity, yeah. And the anatomy of the human interstitium. Dr. Theise's studies in complexity theory, which we'll talk about tonight, have led to interdisciplinary collaborations in fields such as integrative medicine, consciousness studies, and science-religion dialogue. So Neil, I'd like to sort of immediately veer off in an odd direction. So I'm going to read a list of things that have happened in your life.
Oh!
Some of them you told me about over the years. Neil and I have been friends for 25 years.
Yeah.
Some of them are things...
Remember dialing up for AOL?
and then some of them are things that we shared together. And I really just want to do this as a way to start the evening to sort of prompt you to see if you can think about how you might want to tell everyone how you got to here with the book. Mm-hmm. So you were a little kid, you were Jewish, raised by your father and mother with your brother. There's a Connecticut connection. Do you want to mention
Yeah,
what
I
that is?
grew up in Hartford. We landed there because my father was born in Germany. Not good if you were Jewish in the 1920s, 30s. And he went to England on something called the Kindertransport. And when he was 12, and his parents were killed in the war, but two of his uncles survived, and one of them had a sponsor in Hartford, and he sponsored the other uncle. And when my father, after the war, all these kids who had been on the Kindertransport, they were officially stateless. And so he wanted to go live with them. But he came through New York City. Oh God! See, long stories. Yeah.
So
the short story is he met my mother, who was English, when he was 14 and she was 12. But she was a wealthy family, and he was a German orphan, so they didn't speak. But he was in love with her, and then they bumped into each other in New York when her family came at the same time, and so he brought her to Hartford, and that's where.
That's the Connecticut.
Yeah. And that's book 2, but never mind.
So, as a kid, you loved astronomy.
Yeah.
You loved science.
Talcott Mountain Science Center, anybody? Yeah, okay, yeah.
And that led you, of course, to medicine and medical school. Along the way, you also had to figure out about your being gay.
Right.
And very early on, you met your husband, Mark, of 35 years.
Yeah, 36.
36 years, okay.
Yeah.
You're a liver pathologist, you live in New York City, you've done extensive stem cell research, you've explored Zen Buddhism, we both have lost.
I'm a senior student at the Village Zendo, and I've been a Zen student for 34 years. So,
okay.
I don't just explore it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
And then more recently...
it's not a competition. I can't tell you how delightful and strange this is to be sitting here doing this. Okay.
Because I'm totally in my work mode. Which
I never see that.
Yeah, he doesn't see that. So
I'm going to try and,
That's okay. I'm getting to the end here. So So yeah, and then shortly after we met, you lost your brother.
Yeah,
You've explored. Well, maybe this is the wrong
that
word.
was careless of me.
So you've incorporated shamanism into your life. You've become BFFs with Deepak Chopra. We both lost our moms around the same time. And then there was, of course, jumping into the more present day, there was the interstitium discovery a couple years ago.
2018.
2018.
5 years ago now.
And then zooming up to today is the book. So to start us off for this evening, how did you get here? Like, what things influenced you to get to the point where you decided to write this book? And
it's good question. One of the things that surprised me, I still get a charge out of the book. I'll hold it. Is that when I finished it, it was after I finished it, I realized, oh, my whole life is in here. And if I fleshed out where I learned every tidbit here, it would be a biography of me. And weirdly, the the earliest stuff going back to that's in here, going back to fifth grade, sixth grade is the quantum physics and the relativity. A good library, the West Hartford Public Library, had this great quantum physics book lying on the shelf. And one of my teachers at King Philip gave me a book which I still have on relativity. So there's a lifelong thing where I'm just curious about everything. And in particular, the way I look back and think about it is that both the scientific impulse and the religious impulse I have sort of come from the same place, that when I was really little, I felt a really strong affinity for the what seemed like a natural world in the suburb of West Hartford around me. And that sense of intimacy, I think, was a big part of the spiritual impulse, but it was also manifested as curiosity. Once I got old enough to ask questions about why is the world what it is, that started going down the science route. And I just I never had a plan or plotted my way through anything in my career. It's I just follow my nose. What interests me is what I do. And when my interests change, I drop that and I go on to something else. So my practice as a physician is as a diagnostic liver pathologist, which means I sit at the microscope most of the day looking at slides of people's liver biopsies or slides of their explants when they get a liver transplant. And so I spend a lot of my day both at the cellular level and at the everyday level, and that becomes important to the book too. But in 1996, looking at the sections of the transplant biopsies I was getting, I started to notice some things about some cells in these livers that people hadn't noticed before. And that, trying to figure out what those were, led me to being able to prove that livers had stem cells. And now it's sort of a commonplace that everything has stem cells. But back then, only the skin, the lining of the digestive tract, and the bone marrow and blood had stem cells. So to say that the liver had stem cells and be able to prove that, that was kind of a big deal at the time. It took a few years to nail it down. It was published in the December issue, 1999, of the Big Liver Journal. That led me, but it had been in play for 4 years. And to trace that down, I was at NYU at that time too. And they sent me on sabbatical to Yale. So I got to live in New Haven. What I thought was going to be 3 months, it turned into 2 years, where what I had figured out for the liver stem cells didn't explain everything from the people who had been doing animal work. And that led me to think that maybe there were stem cells for the liver coming from outside the liver. And so we set to work on that. And that's the adult stem cell plasticity thing. It was my group with a few others out there, and Diane Krause at Yale was my partner. We saw that adult stem cells from the bone marrow could become any cell in the body. And that we published that in May 2001 in the journal Cell, which for a liver pathologist to publish in Cell, that's the biomedical research basic science journal. And that was published in May. And in October, George Bush gave his address to the nation on stem cells, triggered by our work. Because now, if adult stem cells can do everything embryonic stem cells can do, we don't need to do embryonic stem cell research, which was a false equation. And I think this is why we still don't have any decent therapies from stem cells, because we're still dealing with the politics that sprang out from there. So adult stem cell plasticity, and it went viral as much as things could go viral back then. And one of my friends in England, I had gone to London to learn liver pathology, and I met this old friend of mine now, Peter Ride. He was at the University of Westminster and curated artists speaking with scientists, because this interdisciplinary communication was becoming a thing, particularly in Europe. It's now happening here too more. And he got a grant for this artist named Jane Prophet, who was also a friend of his, and he was just plotting to introduce us to each other, but he figured he'd get some money to make it happen. So the money had her come to New York 3 times, and I went to England 3 times, and all we had to do was record the conversations so other people could study them. And because they were recorded, I have the quote in the standard version of talks I give on this stuff, where I said to her, she said to me, I was telling her about plasticity, and she said how the way I was talking about cells moving around the body sounds like how people talk about ants self-organizing into ant colonies. And then she talked to me about complexity theory. And that was the first I'd ever heard of it. And that happened, and I know the date because it's on the transcript. It was May 9th, and 21 years later, on that day, the book came out. So, and I only noticed that last week. So that was, that's the short version. I worked with her, and we brought in a computer scientist, a modeler, and a mathematician, those are the tools you need to investigate complexity theory. We started publishing some papers, and it was just the sort of thing that as I followed the ideas, they just kept leading to other ideas further and further. And so complexity theory basically is the notion that if you have interacting individuals like ants making a colony, or the cells in your body, or humans in a room like this, or walking down the street in a city, if they interact with each other according to 4 basic rules, they, in a bottom-up fashion, they give rise to global structures that you can't predict from the local interactions. And then the interactions are happening totally locally, and you get these emergent properties or emergence of these global structures. So in the ant colony, this would be food lines of ants, and establishing a cemetery for dead ants, and a refuse dump for garbage. There's no ant in the colony that's monitoring everything and deciding what's needed and how the colony should adapt. And how many of you have ever heard of chaos theory? Okay, and fractals? So chaos and fractals depended on computer modeling, because it was looking at how things organize themselves in space and time. And so you had to have computer models. Without computers, we couldn't have discovered chaos. The next thing to be discovered was chaos doesn't cover everything. And what it didn't cover was living things. And that turns out to be what complexity covers. So it's the science that tells us how living things arise from self-organizing individuals, whether they're molecules or cells or people or living beings in an ecosystem, et cetera. And the principles that I discuss in the book are what allows complex systems, unlike chaotic systems or other systems, to adapt and develop over time, to change in response to a changing environment. And what that is, that's rule number 4. There's always got to be a little randomness in how ants are interacting with each other, or how people are interacting with each other. If you have too much randomness, you don't get any self-organization. If you have, and you're not going to get a colony, you're not going to get a body, you're not going to get a liver. But if you have too little, then the system doesn't have any way to adapt if the environment changes. And so that's a machine, and machines break down. They don't die, they just break, and they can't regenerate, they can't change. So you need a low-level randomness, and that low-level randomness is what generates all the creative possibilities for a living system. So one of my mentors, and I talk about this in the book, Stu Kaufman, one of the founders of complexity theory, he talks about how in a complex system in the present moment, you don't have an infinite possible number of futures. You have a constrained number of futures, but it's not, but you can't define it because it's all about this low level of randomness. And he calls these the adjacent possibles. So in this present moment, there's a sort of a cloud of adjacent possibles for what the next moment might be. And then the next moment happens, one of those is selected, all the others fade away, disappear, and now you have a new cloud of adjacent possibles. And that's why living systems can't be predicted. That's why we can't predict history, we can't predict when we're going to live or die, we can't predict, no matter how much we plan, we're talking about possibilities. And it's never definable by a simple equation. So chaos is said to be, talk about systems that are predictably predictable. If you have the famous butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, the motion of the air will turn into a tornado in Texas. That's real. All the systems we use for predicting weather are computer models of weather as chaos. But if the butterfly flaps its wings exactly the same way, it will always give you the same tornado. So it's predictably predictable. But complex systems, meaning everything that's alive, you and me and the world we live in, is predictably unpredictable. It can't ever be predictable. So that's already got a little bit of a shimmer of the spiritual around it, which was kind of striking. I didn't expect the science to go there in that way. And I was kind of being obsessed with my stem cell research. And because it was very high-powered, high-pressured, of a kind I had never experienced before. And we were under a lot of competition. We were doing lots of experiments, reporting all sorts of data, very much in the thick of it. And it hit me sometime in there that, wait a second, I'm talking about stem cells that I'm seeing on the glass slide of my human specimens, the biopsies and stuff, or on the mice. We did animal work for a while. But what I was studying were my own cells. These things that I'm seeing are happening in my body. And that started to become this real obsessive thing that I couldn't shake. That I'm this flock of cells, a colony of cells that looks at this level of scale like I'm a solid thing. But at the next level of scale down, it's just a dance of cells, the way ants dance with each other and interact and form the colony. My cells are forming my body. So which is it? Am I cells or am I a body? And this got to be, if you're familiar with Zen practice, there's something called a Zen koan. This became a koan, this puzzle I couldn't let go of. And I was walking down the street, either 19th or 20th, reaching Park Avenue, walking west on the northeast corner, just so you can picture it. And the traffic was going, and then the light changed, and the people standing next to me on the corner stepped off the curb, and I couldn't step off the curb because my leg had become a flock of cells, and I couldn't direct it to move. And then I could. But there was this moment of experiencing a big piece of my body as something I wasn't in charge of, that was self-organizing. And then, this is the home stretch on this story. And a few weeks later, I'd been a Zen student at that point, I guess, for about 10, 12 years. And my practice was, at that particular point, was following my breath in meditation. And I was responsible at my Zendo for opening up for morning meditation on Thursdays. And I happened to be alone. No one else came that particular morning. And I was sitting there trying to follow my breath, but obsessed with this, am I a body or am I cells? And I couldn't turn it off. And I sort of, meditating, sank deep into that. And at one point I looked up, and on the altar across the room, I saw the stick of incense I had lit turning into smoke. And I get choked up when I talk about this one. And it just, all of a sudden, is it stick or is it smoke? Am I cells or am I a body? Oh, it's both. And this is what's meant by the Buddhist concept of emptiness of inherent existence, that things have no inherent existence. You are a thing from one perspective, but equally and totally validly in the same way, you're just a process arising from other things. And it was an experience of the concept, and rather than just an intellectual thing, and it just hit me in a flash. And I had never, ever in my life been interested in finding a way to bring the science together with the religion. I didn't see the point in that. It wasn't of interest to me. But all of a sudden, unexpectedly, in the Zendo that morning, the complexity theory had met my Zen Buddhist practice, and they were exactly the same thing. And right from there, you could easily get to Buddhist concepts of interdependence and impermanence and karmic law, etc. And I realized I'd stumbled into something that was more profound. And the next question was, well, are cells things that are reifiable? Do they have inherent existence? No, they're just self-organizing molecules in water. And the molecules, what are they? They're just self-organizing atoms, and those are just self-organizing subatomic particles. But it's not an infinite regress to ever smaller things. Quantum physics, and this is where sixth grade came, the West Hartford Public Library came in handy. Space-time, which Einstein called the fabric of the universe and pictured in relativity as being smooth, turns out, according to quantum mechanics, to be particulate. There's a smallest length and a smallest unit of time, and it's not a vacuum, it's not empty, it's an energy-rich field. And because of E equals mc squared, back to Einstein, that energy pops up into particles with mass. And it does so often in matter-antimatter pairings, so as soon as they erupt and become something, they self-annihilate and go back into energy. And they call this the quantum foam, which is one of my favorite things I learned about in this. And so space-time, the fabric of our universe, is this seething energy field where particles are popping in and out, arising and then self-destructing. But sometimes they don't self-destruct. And when they don't, they can interact with each other like ants. And those become subatomic particles, and those become atoms, and those become molecules, and that becomes the entire universe, which in its entirety is a complex system. And that then gets you into Jewish mysticism and shamanic stuff and blah, blah, blah. And so that's where I got the book from. And I've been talking about this. I've been going around doing talks on this for 20 years, developing the ideas. And partly how they developed is I'd give a talk to a room of people and someone would ask a question that I hadn't thought of, and it would send me in a new direction. And I kept I was being led, it felt like, down the path.
Do you want to read a little bit from the book?
Oh, we were going to do that, weren't we?
Yeah, let's read a little bit from the book.
Okay.
And as you prepare for that, I will say that when I read about quantum foam in the book, I immediately thought that would make a really great name for a nightclub. So if you're wondering out in the audience if this is a little highbrow for you, I'm your guy. We'll keep it good.
My husband said, because he didn't get to look at it till it was finished, a long story. And he said, well, if I can read it. So I'm just going to read the first chapter. 1, the science of being. Nothing in the universe is more complex than life. Microscopic life abounds both in the scalding, pressurized, sunless depths of the ocean trenches and upon the highest frozen Himalayan peaks. In between, throughout skies, in oceans, and across lands, life is endlessly on the move. And surely in the billions of years in which organisms will continue to thrive on the planet, there will be vastly more life forms, with a variety beyond anything we might imagine. The complexity of all this rich abundance has long resisted explanation. The origins of life remain deeply mysterious. What biological wonders might emerge next are beyond our knowing. If we were even to begin to fathom it all, a theory of complexity was necessary. Complexity theory is the study of how complex systems manifest in the world. The use of the word complexity here does not mean complicated, however. Complexity in this context refers to a class of patterns of interactions, open-ended, evolving, unpredictable, yet adaptive and self-sustaining. It is this complexity that we will explore, how life self-organizes from the substance of our universe, from interactions within the quantum foam to the formation of atoms and molecules, cells, human beings, social structures, ecosystems, and beyond. A distinguishing feature of life's complexity is that in every single instance, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Even if one knows the characteristics and behaviors of all the individual elements of a living system, a cell, a body, an ecosystem, one cannot predict the extraordinary properties that emerge from their interactions. In complexity theory, these surprising outcomes are called emergent properties or just plain emergence. This unpredictability is both a core subject of complexity theory and a key feature of what it has to offer our understanding of the world. Neither we nor our universe is machine-like. A machine doesn't have the option to change its behavior if its environment changes or becomes overwhelming. Complex systems, including human bodies and human societies, can change their behaviors in the face of the unpredictable. That creativity is the essence of complexity. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So much is packed into that simple expression. Colloquially, the phrase evokes community, teamwork, elevated purpose, the ways in which people with their own differing talents and abilities, when working together, can create synergies beyond the scope of what any of the individuals alone might have been capable of. A winning team, a social movement, a perfect dinner party. You know who that's about.
Yes.
My husband makes great dinner parties, but it's all about the guests.
Mark cooks, Neil talks.
Yeah.
In case you were wondering.
And thanks to my mom, we got a dishwasher, so I don't have to clean up either. But complexity extends far beyond human beings and their social behavior. Examples of complex systems are found not only in sociology and biology, but also in chemistry and physics. The universe is a shimmering web of complexity that continually births and nurtures life, tempting us to believe that life might even be its central purpose and most fundamental expression. Complexity bridges the seemingly unbridgeable gap between the universe at its most infinitesimal, described by quantum mechanics, and at its most vast, described by the theory of relativity. As successful as these two most successful of all scientific theories have been, they are unable on their own to illuminate how we go from the most basic elements of existence, space, time, matter, energy, to the complex behaviors of living organisms and their social structures, ecosystems, cultures, and civilizations. It is complexity theory that shows how the entities arising from fundamental physics actively weave themselves into ever larger structures step by step until they become the fabric of our everyday lives and of the dynamic natural living systems that surround us. While the aims of complexity science are grandly ambitious, when studied with careful intention, its lessons can also be deeply personal. It can solve some of the most crucial riddles of our sense of being. In the womb, and for a relatively short time afterward, we are in a seamless world in which we experience no divisions. There is no self, no other, no baby, and no mother. Gradually, inevitably, in early infancy, we move from this state of intimate wholeness into another state, one of separation. We become bounded by our skin, everything inside it an eye, everything outside it the world, parts, not wholes. Occasionally, if we are fortunate, we find ourselves in a situation with other people in which we achieve that feeling of complete unity, of something bigger than ourselves. In the absence of that experience, many of us will spend our days struggling to understand how I and the world relate. If we're at all able to recall that sense of seamless unity, we may look over our shoulder and wonder, how can I get back to that? And if we're not able to recall it, we may instead just be left with the uneasy sense that something is missing, even though we're unsure what that something is. Complexity theory not only provides us with scientific understanding, but as we travel down its paths, the implications of the theory can also enlighten us, providing insight into everything from the permeable boundaries of our bodies to the nature of consciousness. Complexity theory can foster an invaluable flexibility of perspectives and awaken us to our true deep intimacy with the larger whole, so that we might return to what we once had, our birthright of being one with all. Excuse me. I get all choked up.
So, I have this list of quotes and things, but something later on in this packet that came, it was really a surprise to me when I read the book, was this idea that that we aren't separate from, and that everyone is somehow interacting with everyone else on a cellular level. And I thought that it was an amazing discovery for me to find this in your book. And also I felt like for the time that we're living in, because we are so PTSD'd out from COVID, that and the separation, that to me it was like, it really gave me like a completely different viewpoint for that. So I don't know if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So first I'll introduce an important phrase, complementarity. And if some of you know anything of quantum physics, you know that light can be described either as waves or particles, but they can't ever both be seen at the same time. It depends on how you observe them. And that's considered a complementarity. To say light is a wave is only half true. To say light is particles is only half true. The complete picture is both, but we can only see one or the other at any one time. It's exactly equal. A way I like to give people, I can show you. I happen to have a picture right here. You've probably seen this picture. Can you see it? Two faces looking at each other, and the space between them looks like a vase? That's a complementarity. Is it two faces, or is it a vase? Well, you can only see the faces or the vase at one time, but you know a complete description requires both. Both are equally true, but you can only experience one or the other. So this notion that something looks like a thing on the one hand, my finger, or a flock of cells on the other hand, and remember, it's not just my human cells, it's all the bacterial cells that cover my body, our bodies, and all the inside crevices of our bodies. That's called the microbiome. And we know that that without your microbiome, you can't exist as a functioning human being. They're required for the microscopic anatomy, the physiologic functioning. If you get rid of all your bacteria, your skin will start to break down, your immune system will fail, you won't be able to absorb any food, and you'll be dead within a week. So we need this. This is our body, as much as our human cells are our body. What we also now know, okay, so the idea that it's a thing bounded by my skin, or it's a flock of cells, human and otherwise, is a complementarity. Which is it? It's both, but you can only encounter it one way or the other at one time. So the boundaries issue comes in. At this level of scale, we're all bags of skin, right? and you're there, and I'm here, and everything outside my skin is other. But at the cellular level, first off, when you're cleaning the dust in your room, that's mostly dead skin cells that you're cleaning up. So your body is filling the room you live in. But you've got the microbiome too. There, I've left my microbiome behind. There, I've shared some of my microbiome. And what we now know is that if you look at people living in a household, the people and their pets share one large microbiome that's a merger of all their microbiomes into one single entity that happens to have a few islands it lands on that are cats, dogs, or humans. So at the cellular level, where are your boundaries? It's not here. It's the spaces in which you live, right? So cells are molecules. At the molecular level, where are your boundaries? We're breathing out carbon dioxide. That's absorbed by the plants of the world, and they breathe out oxygen that we breathe in. So at the molecular level, what are your boundaries? The entire biomass of the planet. What about at the atomic level? Well, there's not an atom in your body that you haven't drunk, eaten, or breathed from the planet. So are we individuals walking around feeling we're separate and lonely on this rock we call Earth? Or are we the atomic substance of the planet that took 3.5 billion years to evolve to self-organize into creatures that walk around thinking they're separate, but they're not? At the atomic level, our boundaries are the entire planet, organic and inorganic. When you get to the quantum level, and this won the Nobel Prize in part last year, we know that quantum entities don't have any boundaries at all. At the quantum level, what is the boundary of our bodies? It's the entire universe. There's no out there at all. It's all inside. So all of these things are in complementarity. They're all true all the time, absolutely, inarguably. You are one, you are seamless part of the entire universe, and you're also this lonely little creature that's separate. And both things are true. So when I talk about flexibility of perspectives, in that last paragraph, this is what I mean. If complexity theory shows us the fact that all of these complementarities are true, then it behooves us to remember to think about that. So when you're caught up in your stuff of you feeling separate and alone, yeah, but where's your microbiome? How many people have you shared that with? You're not disconnected, et cetera, et cetera. And so I play this I learned from Einstein in my first Einstein book, Thought Experiments. I play these games in my head. Okay, I've got a problem to solve. What if I look at it from this perspective? What if I look at it from this perspective? And it gives me different perspectives, and it loosens my grip on the one that says, oh, I'm this suffering being.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So another surprise that I had in the book was, so I think it's maybe apparent now, but is it accurate for me to say that there are basically 3 parts to this explanation of complexity theory in your book, right? The empirical science, the philosophy, and the metaphysics,
Right.
spirituality. That in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my biggest surprise, because I don't think we've ever talked about this as friends, was the philosophy part. So can you just talk a little bit about and explain to everyone like why that was important and how you saw that connection when you started researching and writing?
Right. So I never studied philosophy. I couldn't care less about philosophy. Sometime in here, people started accusing me of being a philosopher, and I'm like, I'm a liver pathologist. I'm not a philosopher. But as I said, I would give these talks and bump into people. And one of the most important people I bumped into was this guy named Minas Kafatos. He's Greek. And he's a professor of quantum physics and cosmology out in California. He's also a Kashmiri Shaivist, which is its own mystical practice. And more recently, I think because of my influences, has started doing a Buddhist thing. And I was invited. So the complexity stuff, we talked about how it led to integrative medicine type stuff. And I was collaborating with someone at Tibet House in New York City on that. He was invited to give a talk at the annual Science of Consciousness meetings that was being held in Stockholm that year. And he has a fear of speaking in public. So he said, please come with me and you can hold my hand while I give this talk. But to do that, I had to come up with something to submit for my own talk. Otherwise, I couldn't get my institution to pay for me to go if I was just going as a tourist. So I had to come up with something about consciousness. And so complexity, you just think about things and you get new things. And so I submitted something about consciousness. And but I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, I kind of did, but and I was sitting in the big lecture hall for the main stage where there was a couple of thousand people, and there was this physicist, turns out to be Menas, on stage talking about how to understand consciousness we needed a new kind of physics, and quantum physics and relativity were that. But we're still waiting for a new kind of biology to understand this. And I'm like, I've got the new kind of biology. I've been writing about it for 10 years now. No one's paying attention to me. And I got really angry and walked out of the lecture hall because I just couldn't stand it. Later, my little thing had been accepted for presentation, so I was in a room with maybe this many seats and half as many people. Tiny little room to present my silly little ideas about consciousness. And who's the moderator for the session but Menas? And I give him my talk, and he comes up to me after, he goes, I need to talk to you. And so we started like Jane and I did, like any really good interdisciplinary conversation. We just started sharing what we do. And he was in California, I'm in New York, so we would just talk for hours on the phone, telling each other what we think, what we do, learning each other's languages. And the first paper we came up with was discussing, he drew my attention to the idea that Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum physics, who coined the word complementarity and its use, he was very explicit in his writings that complementarity was not a quantum-specific thing, that it was a principle that applied globally to the entire universe. And using complexity theory, we now had a way to explain complementarity as Bohr saw it. So that was our first paper together. And the one thing that, we were at this consciousness meeting, and the one thing my model of the universe as a complex system didn't contain was consciousness. And if you don't contain that, what good is your model for existence? So I had to start learning about consciousness. And people looked at complexity as a way of explaining consciousness from the beginning. And I saw it too from the very first moments Jane told me about it. Oh, the brain is made up of all these cells interacting with each other through chemical signals and electrical signals. It's a complex system. Isn't mind just the emergent global property of the brain as a complex system? So that's materialism, that mind arises from material existence. So that's one possibility. It doesn't work. We'll get to that. But if it doesn't work, then what might? Second possibility is that consciousness pervades the universe. That's called panpsychism. And some people say any cell in the universe that's alive, cells are alive, therefore they have mind. And if something has mind, then they have life. So mind and life go together. And if you've ever heard of the Dalai Lama conferences, the mind and life conferences, that's the basis of that idea. Some people say it's not cells. Some people say subatomic particles have consciousness, or the conveyors of consciousness, the way photons convey light. And some people say that consciousness is inherent in space-time itself. So these are all, and so complexity there is how do these little small minds combine with each other into a larger mind that we recognize as our own consciousness. So that's where complexity theory comes in there too. The problem with both of these is something called the hard problem of consciousness, which is coined by the philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s. And he pointed out that there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of studies at this point that where we look at the function and structures of the brain, either functional MRI imaging or EEGs, and we know that certain behaviors or activities in the brain correlate with cognitive experiences. So you look at a rose and your visual cortex lights up in the scan because you're seeing something. And we know that if you see a rose, what's happening is light is bouncing off entering your eye, hitting your retina, causing a chemical signal, which then gives rise to an electrical signal that goes back to your visual cortex. And that's how you see the red of a rose. But what gives rise to the experience of redness? There's nothing there that explains why you should have an interior imagination. You close your eyes and you can see a red rose in front of you. What's doing that? Or the scent of the perfume of a rose, or the prick of your finger if you touch a thorn. We know the mechanics. And if you look in all the scientific literature on this stuff, they never say this part of the brain causes that experience. They say this is a neural correlate of that conscious experience. They're all called neural correlates of consciousness. None of them tell you which caused which. So in summertime, do sunglasses, if someone puts on sunglasses, does that make them want to eat ice cream? Or if someone's eating ice cream, do they think, oh, I should put on sunglasses? No. They correlate with each other very closely because it's a hot, sunny summer day. But one didn't cause the other. No one can prove that the brain's activities and your conscious experience are causative. So that's the materialist problem. There's no explanation for the hard problem of consciousness. The panpsychist level, that's just pushing it down to lower levels of scale. So what's the other option? And this is where philosophy comes in, because it's not a minor, weird, woo-woo thread in Western philosophy. Plato, Kant, Hegel, Spinoza, Whitehead, these are the main thinkers in our Western philosophical tradition. And what they all said is that the mind is what the world is made of. There is no materiality. It arises out of consciousness. So,
explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, and this is again where the religion thing comes in. So this notion, the materialist notion in our culture, that everything can be explained based on the machine-like interactions of material existence. Most people in our culture, even scientists, even many philosophers, don't know of a group called the Vienna Circle, which are a group of philosophers, and I had to read about this shit. Pardon me. Part 3 of the book. This is a more recent acquisition of knowledge. They were a group of philosophers, sociologists, scientists, mathematicians, psychologists in Vienna who were trying to formalize this modern notion that the universe is a machine and utterly predictable and utterly knowable, that started with Newton and Descartes, and that if you knew what the machine was doing today, you could predict what it would be doing tomorrow. And what they came to was there were only 2 valid methods of understanding existence, of the true nature of reality. One was empirical science, and what that means is you have a scientist observing an experiment, and they are separate from each other. There can't be any impact of the scientist's observation on the thing, otherwise you can't determine causation, you can't prove anything. The second thing that they settled on was formal mathematics and formal logic, that you could theoretically develop a system of equations, theories, and proofs that would completely describe all of existence, completely and consistently. And things that couldn't be observed or studied by mathematics, or described by mathematics or by empirical science, were merely metaphysics, and they used that as it was a bad word. If they were talking to each other in a room and one said something that he couldn't prove, the other one would smack them down with, that's just metaphysics. So metaphysics was to be banished. And isn't that what our culture says? Anything that's metaphysical is woo-woo. If you want to know the true nature of reality, we look to science and mathematics, period. That's it. But quantum physics came along and showed that at the quantum level, you can't separate subject and object, The difference between light as waves or particles is whether there's a conscious observer or not. It's consciousness that determines whether light is waves or particles, not the other way around. So Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum physics, said, this is a good quote. And I happen to have the book. I happen to have Max Planck right here. If this were a Woody Allen movie, does anyone know what I'm referencing? Let's see if I can find this quickly. Not there. Well, no, I can't, not quickly. It's a big paragraph that's really elegant, but the basic final sentence is, we can't get behind consciousness. There is no getting behind consciousness. Consciousness comes first, and matter is derivative of consciousness. So that's quantum physics. Complexity shows us the same complementarity and dependence on perspective. Which view of the world do you have? There's no separation of subject and object if our boundaries are in fact encompassing everything. There's never true separation of me and the slide I'm looking at under the microscope. So empirical science doesn't really exist in its absolute form, and it can't predict everything about existence. So how about mathematics? Well, I said they look to mathematics to be able to give a complete and consistent description of all of existence. And that would be the success for understanding the true nature of reality. But there was this guy, one of their younger members, sitting very quietly in the back of the Vienna Circle meetings, who didn't agree with them, and he was just waiting to drop a bomb. And the bomb he dropped, his name is Kurt Gödel. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Pulitzer Prize book.
Name again, please.
Kurt Gödel. Godel, and there's an umlaut over the O. Gödel Escher Bach was, that was a bookstore, working in the bookstore when I was 16. What Gödel showed is that if a system of mathematics was complete, describing everything, it would necessarily be inconsistent with itself, contradict itself, and so all of its logic would disintegrate, because you could prove anything if there's a contradiction within the system. But more importantly, he showed that if a system is consistent, there will always be truths about the system that cannot be proven from within the system, but we can know to be true. And his proof of how he did this, people describe the proof as like Gothic cathedrals or the great works of Bach. It's this extraordinary mathematical feat that's just itself worth looking up. And I try and give a little bit of a flavor of it in the book. But what he did was he showed that there are truths we can know to be true, but we can't prove them to be true. In which case, how do we know them to be true? Intuition, metaphysics. And so the Vienna Circle and our whole cultural notion of how we can know the true nature of reality as a materialist thing completely fell apart on its own terms. And yet that didn't reach the greater awareness, because we all think science and math are how you tell the true nature of reality. And if you can get to metaphysics, then what kinds of metaphysics? Meditation, the mind looking in on itself. Well, that's not empirical science, because there's no separation of the mind looking at itself, right? But, and we're getting to my answer to your question. One way of thinking about an experience of deep meditation, imagine going into a cave and there are pools of water that are separate from each other. And if you dive down into one of those pools, you discover there's a huge cavern with a river running underneath it. The pools look separate, but the stream of consciousness that underlies everything is the stream of consciousness that's eternal and infinite, in which there's no separation of subject and object. And that's the universal consciousness out of which our minds arise and out of which existence arises. One last little step. I know this is a lot. There's not going to be a quiz. And one of the things I love about talking about this stuff is everyone finds something. But people come up to me all the time for 20 years. They go, I told people I went to this great talk and they asked me what it was about and I couldn't tell them. But talking about it here, I'm looking around the room and there isn't anything I've said where someone didn't have a light bulb over their head. And that's what I'm going after. It's not like you have to know what's in the book and how we get there. The book sets off different light bulbs for everybody. So you had your own set of light bulbs. Other people have theirs. If there's no subject-object split in the underlying consciousness that gives rise to existence, Kashmiri Shaivism is a brand of contemplative practice where they're interested in how you go from that, it's called non-duality, no separation of subject-object. It's just awareness, pure awareness.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes. If you need a library card or special assistance, please come circulate it now. And as a reminder, the Wi-Fi will shut down at 7:45, 15 minutes before we close. Thank you.
That's it.
If that stream of water underneath the cavern is pure awareness, just awareness, but it starts to become aware of itself, then there's sort of a little bit of a shimmying into sensing that it contains the possibility of being a subject and the possibility of being an object. And as those start to become more substantial, then you start to have separation into subject and object. And if you have separation, well, how does separation happen? It happens in space, in time, in other dimensions perhaps. And so as the non-dual pure awareness starts to become aware of itself as subject and object, space and time come into existence. And then you have space-time, and then you have an energy-rich field, and then you have the quantum foam, and you have the whole complex universe springing into existence, all because of within the ground of being, which is pure consciousness, it's starting to become aware of itself. The universe is how that fundamental consciousness is able to understand itself, look at itself, and appreciate itself. And so in every single moment, we're just expressions of that universal consciousness. And we may think of ourselves as separate, et cetera, et cetera. And if you go, it's not just contemplative practice that can lead you to this sense of unity. People who have a deep practice of service, people who have a deep practice of artistic expression, people who have deep devotional practices. There are all sorts of routes to become aware of this. And so we've dispensed with materiality, we've dispensed with the brain makes mind, we've dispensed with panpsychism. What we're left with is what's called idealism, the philosophies of Plato and all those other philosophers, the underlying implications of quantum physics, relativity, and complexity, is that intuitions are a way to understand the world, and what those intuitions lead to is that mind comes first. And if you want to call that God in your tradition, that's fine. And if not, that's fine too, because there are no distinctions within pure awareness because it's the non-dual. But in becoming aware of itself, it gives rise to duality, what we see as our material existence.
So
in 175 pages.
So I want to get to your questions. I just want to end with one final question to you. Just a quick question. So well, we can do this pretty quickly.
Yeah, okay.
And also I want to mention too, because I'll probably forget it if I don't. So Ron is here from Fairfield TV. That's why we're recording. And then Craig Kennedy is here from Fairfield Bookstore with books to purchase, and Neil will be signing books afterwards as well. So my final question before we open it up to the audience is, what's next for you, Neil Theise?
I didn't want to write this book. This wasn't the book I was going to write. As you know,
As I know.
my mom had a very interesting gradual, very gradual decline over about 8 or 9 years. She lost her short-term memory. And I'd always wondered what she would be like if she smoked pot, and now I knew she was sort of like a stoner all the time. And she started having these enlightenment experiences and experiences of talking to dead people and who told her things she couldn't possibly know. And then she'd tell me, and I'd go like, how could you know that? And spirit guides started coming to her. She saw the particulate nature of space and time. I walked into her room one day and she was lying in the bed. She had 24-hour home care, apartment a few blocks away from us. And she's just smiling, looking up at the ceiling. And I said, what you looking at? She said, space. I said, what's that like? She said, it's not what I expected at all. Why? She goes, well, I thought it was smooth, but it turns out to be more like chopping carrots. And I was like, really? She goes, yeah, and time too. It's not smooth. That's also like chopping carrots. And it's so beautiful. I wish you and Mark and the kids could see it. So, and she passed away in a bliss bubble, in a bliss state. So I wanted to write about that. And so I got an agent through Deepak, actually. Helps to have friends in high places. And I met him through the consciousness stuff too. Actually, Manas introduced me to him, blah, blah, blah. And so I got an agent and we wrote a proposal for this book, tentatively titled Sarah in the In-Between, because she sort of hovered there for a while, and sent it out. And there were some publishers who were interested, but they all said, nice, sounds like an interesting book and it seems like he can write, but why would we want to know about this guy and his mother? And two of them separately Googled me and saw these talks online and said, oh, well, we'd want to hear from this guy. He's got to write a book about that first. And I never wanted to write about this because I thought it would take 400 pages and have to be fully referenced. And I have a day job. I didn't get time off to do this. And my agent said, no, you can write a smaller version. Just take one of your talks and turn it into a book. And so that's the short story of how the book happened. And now I'm like, oh God, I'm a writer. There's this other book. And I decided this was a very intense, difficult process because of time and stuff. Story I'm not going to tell you about.
And because it's writing a book.
And because it's writing a book. And I thought, when this was over, I thought, I'm never writing a book. And I could hear my mother saying in my ear, Tata Shana, Yiddish for, her kid. Tata Shana, I don't need you to make me famous. I need you to be happy. And I felt completely released from the need to write a book about my mother. But now it's come out, and I can't stop thinking about the next one. And so my agent and my editor and I spoke about it this week, and we're starting to work on that.
There you go. That's
Yeah.
the answer. All right, questions?
Nothing short with me. So
Anybody have any questions?
I'll try.
Yes.
It was wonderful. It was an amazing talk. Thank you. My question's about AI. And
This is.
I'm
No
gonna-
one ever asked me about AI, and now every go
my
ahead.
husband's obsessed with it.
Yeah,
He's
that's
been
fine.
talking about singularity and when AI is going to reach the next level, and I keep telling him I'm just waiting for AI to just run our lives so that we take care of everything. Anyway, so I'm wondering what you in your research and the circles that you're in, what people are saying, because is it this threat to humanity, or is it something we
Well,
can
So
look forward
can I?
to?
So I'm just for the camera. I'm just going to repeat everybody's questions
Okay,
just so
yeah.
they hear. So the question was, talking about AI. Would you comment on AI? Is it a threat to humanity, or is it going to
Save us
take?
from ourselves.
Are we just going to get paid to sit around and watch Netflix all day while the robots do everything else?
Right.
Yay!
Yay! Yeah, they said Xeroxing would make our lives easier. So first off, artificial intelligence is not artificial consciousness. It's just amazingly high-powered computational stuff. It can't do what Gödel did. The intuition that required to create the proof when you see it, a computer can't algorithmically work their way to that. So no evidence that that's going to happen. But the larger question, is it going to be the end of humanity, or is it going to be some gift? the Buddha said everything is medicine, everything is poison. The first time I gave this talk, I actually tried a lot of this stuff, even though it was mostly science, out at my Zendo, because it's a really smart community of people with varied backgrounds, and it's a good place for me to work things out. And the very first time I gave this talk, it was 2002, one woman in the group said, well, what do you do with morality in this? And I thought about it, and I thought, if you have an iron atom vibrating at a particular philosophy, then it's red hot, because temperature depends on frequency of vibration. Is that good or is that bad? It's completely neutral. But if that red hot iron atom is part of a beautiful chandelier that's being sculpted, that's a beautiful thing. Or is it a piece of shrapnel from a suicide bomber? Oh, morality is scale and observer dependent, the same way boundaries are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is partly why mystical practices are often seen as so dangerous, because they start to bring in this question. From, if you look at the, who knows what the actual name of the tree of knowledge is in the book of Genesis? Really? No one? It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what the difference between Adam and Eve pre-eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that there's a distinction, that there's a duality of good and evil, was the state of non-duality, where they only perceived themselves to be in complete unity, seamless unity with existence. And then they ate the apple that showed them no, there's separation. What's AI going to do? The question is, what are we going to do with it? The dismaying thing is that AI only functions based on the material it can go explore and gather in and synthesize into new stuff. Garbage in, garbage out. If you give it the human history, it's going to give you more human history. And human history hasn't been great. It'll have moments of Mozart and Beethoven and T.S. Eliot and whatever. But so I'm not optimistic.
Okay.
Last thing I didn't mention is that because of that randomness in every complex system, mathematically, complexity lies at the boundary between chaotic systems and perfect order. It's as though chaos and order are pulling at each other, and in that crack that forms at that pulling, that's where life and rich information processing take place. You'd think you could plot mathematically any complex system to a point in that zone, but you can't because of the randomness. So it's moving around in that zone. And given enough time, inevitably, unavoidably, it will stumble out of that zone into chaos or perfect rigid order. And when it does that, it will die, a mass extinction event, either partially or completely. So the gift of that low-level randomness that allows us to be creatively adaptive and alive necessarily implies you will die. We will all die. Will AI be the source of a mass extinction event for humans? Possibly. Maybe global climate change will lead to such chaos that the electrical grids of the world collapse, in which case there are no cell phones, there's no AI. That's not going to be our problem. Or maybe we figure out ways to regulate it and creatively adapt to it. What are the adjacent possibles in the moment? And you can't predict which one is going to be selected. Will it be creative adaptation or a mass extinction event? I'll try for a short answer.
Yeah,
I really will.
I want to leave time for book signings. So just one more question. Yes.
I have a short one.
Yeah.
You mentioned several pathways to non-duality. Would you include LSD among those?
Oh yeah, yeah. The thing about psychedelic use I think, out of the context of a rich cultural tradition in which it has a context in which to deal with the insights. I don't think in general they lead to permanent change. They lead to a flash of recognition like I had in that moment in the Zendo. But that moment ended. And now I'm just telling you what it felt like at the time and creating intellectual context. So I know lots of people who had really spectacular experiences on LSD or peyote, ketamine, I've had some. But do they lead to change? Do they lead to a sustained experience of the nature of reality? That I'm doubtful of, unless it's being done as a consistent practice in a consistent cultural way where you can take those experiences and integrate them into your daily life. So I think, yeah, but what do you do with it?
Thank you, Neil, so much. This has been incredible. Thank you all so much for coming out. I want to remind you that if you are buying books, I mentioned to everybody that Craig was not taking credit cards. He is taking credit cards. So if you've got your credit card, he's there. And Neil will be signing books as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.